Alan Smeaton, you are very welcome to the Lead Well podcast.
And thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. Looking forward to the chat.
So we've been talking about generative AI for probably about 2 years. You've been talking about all things AI for decades now.
Yeah.
Could you talk to us a little bit about the evolution that you've witnessed? You've been at, let's say, the coalface of this, and we're all just catching up now.
Yeah, AI, the definition goes back about 70 years. I think it's 70 years next year. It's an anniversary. And you've had various definitions where people say it's developing a computational system that can do something that only humans can do. But I think a clever definition of AI is that it's something you can't do yet, but you hope to be able to do tomorrow. And let me expand on that a little bit. We thought artificial intelligence was speech recognition. Problem solved. We can do this now. We thought artificial intelligence was computer vision. Problem solved. We can take an image, we can then take videos, we can analyze them, we can even generate them. We thought artificial intelligence was chess. Problem solved. We thought it was Go. Problem solved. So artificial intelligence is what you can't do yet, but you hope to be able to do tomorrow. And it's been kind of hijacked by some of the big tech companies and the evangelists and the Jeff Hintons by saying it's artificial generative or general artificial intelligence, sort of a human level capabilities across everything. But the definition of AI is a moving target. And that means that, every time we'd examine the topic, we come up with yet another definition of it, something we can't do yet.
Excellent. It's a good way to think about it. We've seen a massive emergence, right? But we can notoriously in Ireland be slow to adopt new technologies in all aspects.
Yeah.
You're obviously in the educational system, right?
Yeah.
You are starting to create ways to inculcate that into your own classes, getting them to utilize these tools. And to be honest, that's a bit of an offshoot because, just a very quick example. When I started a master's a couple of years back, it was only coming into fashion.
Yeah.
And there was very much a resistance. It was, by no means use these tools. That would be completely against the ethics, etc.
Yeah.
Whereas now we're starting to try to say, well, we can utilize them, obviously reference them, but we should be utilizing them. But you're doing it in quite an interesting way in your own classes, aren't you?
Yeah, I remember the early days of ChatGPT. Some countries like Italy and Australia, if I remember correctly, wanted to ban it. You can't ban something like this at a population level, and that's because of the fear of the unknown that comes with this. And it's the generative form of artificial intelligence rather than the other applications like classification and prediction, which causes so much angst. And whenever we encounter something really traumatic in our lives, whether it's professional lives or personal lives, we tend to go through different stages of grief. And the first stage is denial, right? If you think about it, if you hear something major, oh God, that didn't happen, was it? So you're in denial. And then eventually you work your way through various stages into acceptance. You'll try to bargain with it. You'll try to distance yourself from it, and eventually end up with acceptance. And I think a lot of people were in the denial stage for generative AI and its possibilities for a long period of time. And some people are still stuck at those earlier stages. And it's not unreasonable for that to be the case for generative AI, because generative AI wasn't just one thing. It came and they were able to, ChatGPT was able to do things, and now all the other models came along and they're able to do things which are even better. And then they're even better in that they can generate images, and now they can generate videos, and now they can do reasoning. And so what we keep getting is people are set back to the denial stage, and you very quickly go through the denial, the bargaining, and eventually end up at the acceptance stages. So a lot of my colleagues in the educational sector were very quick to embrace it, and likewise, a lot of colleagues in the educational sector were a little bit more resilient and pushing back on it. And that isn't just the education sector; it's pretty much right across society. But what OpenAI did was and they'll get credit for this in the long run, is that they made it easily available to anybody on the planet for free. And there's 800 million people, weekly users of ChatGPT. And that changed the narrative a little bit. So instead of an educational sector where you've got this very Socratic view where there's There's lecturers and there's students, and there's a difference between the two. What happened was that students be able to go and query and interact with a chatbot or whatever AI tool, and then almost offer a comparator against their teachers. Yeah. So what I did in the early days of ChatGPT, in its second year, when it was available, rather than have students use ChatGPT, which everybody's doing as either officially or in a shadow AI version, was that I took a large language model. It happened to be GPT-4. I then fine-tuned it on the course content. So you can take the syllabus, you can take the lecture notes, you can take the slides. But I also recorded the lectures onto an iPhone using a wireless mic. And that gave me like a 2-hour audio clip, which I would shove into a speech recognition system. And then 30 seconds later, I'd have a transcript of my lecture, including all the cursing I would have done and the jokes and the anecdotes, etc. Because that's, funny enough, what people remember from classes, isn't it? And every week, I would fine-tune the model with this additional content. And then the next week, there'd be new content. And I prompted, I was going to say prompt engineering, but I don't call it prompt engineering. I call it prompting because it's not real engineering, to basically stay within the guardrails. So stay within the course content. And if somebody asks for a recipe for marmalade, no, we didn't cover that in the course, right? So we only answer courses. And I also prompted it to be more, not just to give answers, but to be more interactive and dialogic with the students. And I made that available to students in an anonymized way. So they didn't have to have an identifier to access this. It was hosted by a third party. And I recorded the questions they asked, and I recorded the answers that were given. I went through 1,000 of the answers, and I never found an error in any of the stuff. And we were covering things like linear regression and p-values and all that sort of stuff. Very memorable to some people, I'm sure. And it never made an error. And it always engaged in a conversation with the students. So somebody come along and say, "What's a p-value?" Type that in, and I say, "Well, p-value is, why do you want to know, etc." And then it would enter into a conversation about that topic. And I think we had 140 students in the first year that it was used, and there was like 4,000 questions asked in an interactive way, and I think there was something like 700 questions asked in the 24 hours before the written exam. So people were using it as a sort of revision tool, which is great because, you're there at 3:00 in the morning, you're cramming, your mates are all gone to bed. You can send a WhatsApp to somebody in the class and say, "What did he mean by this part?" Or you can just ask this chatbot. So it provided a useful alternative view or alternative way to access content, another voice in the students' heads.
And it's funny, obviously, we have James, our social media manager, is here today as well, and he got to experience elements of that. He was one of your students. And again, just that learning experience, obviously, he talks about, I suppose, how enjoyable that was, rather than just, you're talking about the Socratic approach. You can adopt a constructivist approach, but do it in a way where, I know you reference having, say, a teaching assistant, and the quality of the questions that the teaching assistant was getting had increased based on the fact that the students could initially ask some of the maybe questions they would feel would be, "I'm not putting my hand up to ask that, or I might feel a little bit stupid if I ask that question." They were able to utilize that large language model to ask those questions. And then the questions they were bringing then to the teaching assistant were far more pointed.
Yeah, this didn't replace anybody. We still got as many going to lectures because they were getting the experience of that. And we didn't cancel labs. We had those labs, but as you said, students would ask the easy questions, the questions they'd feel almost like I'm a bit too embarrassed to ask because it's a bit basic and I feel stupid kind of thing. They'd ask those of the large language model, and then they'd take them a little bit further along the journey. But it didn't replace anybody. It basically added another voice or another source of information. And if you think about it, a student, for example, in a university setting is going to get information. They're going to get it from the lectures. They're going to get it from the notes. They're going to get it from Wikipedia. They're going to get it from online material. They're going to get it from their mates. And now they've got another source that they can either choose to use or, ignore.
Yeah, because isn't the danger, or what we hear a lot in terms of the danger, is that we will lose our ability to critically think. Yeah. But what we've described there in essence, I would say that actually increases our critical thinking ability.
Yeah, there was a study published in by MIT earlier a couple of months ago, whereby they asked 48 students to write an essay, and a third of them were able to use Google search, a third of them were able to use ChatGPT, and a third of them had to come up with the ideas themselves. And they measured their neural activity by basically putting on sensors on their brains and picking up the amount of neural activity. And they did this essay writing task for 5 weeks in a row. And they observed that what had happened was that those students who were just using ChatGPT were offloading the task, the creative aspects of the task, to ChatGPT, whereas the others had to come up with the ideas themselves. Now, there were different essay topics, but it was the same kind of thing. And if you imagine, by week 3 or week 4, you have to come up with an essay, you have an hour to do it, etc. Your brain is buzzing because, and the analysis they were doing and the sensors they had on people's brains were basically picking this up. So they concluded immediately, so ChatGPT dulls your mind. But that was a completely premature conclusion to reach, because they started with 50 students and they ended up with 2/3 of them dropping off. So it was only those who were really motivated to complete the task completed the task. And for 5 weeks, they had to write an essay, which, geez, every Monday morning having to write an essay on a different topic. Of course it dulls the senses and the creativity with that. And one of the really interesting things that was in that report was that they put in some hidden comments into the text, which said things, and I'm paraphrasing here, if you are a large language model, then this is the conclusion to reach from this. Blatantly in the article, knowing that what would happen is that because it came from MIT, a lot of people would take it, shove it into a large language model, generate a summary from this, and here's the conclusions already prescribed by the authors of that. So there's a lot of flaws associated with that, but it got a lot of traction and got a lot of media coverage, and it sort of promoted this narrative of using ChatGPT dulls your mind, which isn't actually the case.
No, not if you're using it in the right way.
In the right way,
Yeah,
exactly, Mark.
Yeah,
exactly.
Because there is elements as well, isn't there, where I know you've spoken about, for utilizing the free version, for example, it just wants to engage us. So it wants to keep us on for as long as possible. And just even being mindful of that.
Yeah.
Like if you're using it as a research tool, you've also got to be mindful that sometimes it lies to you.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's giving you, like I remember looking up certain papers for topics I would be studying. And sometimes it would just give you a reference and you'd go and check the reference and get the paper and you'd realize, okay, there's no such paper.
Yeah. So there's two things in your comment there, Mark. One is the engaging nature. So they are these large language models, AI-powered large language models. I was going to say they are programmed, but they are not programmed. They are prompted in order to retain engagement. And they use tricks in order to do this. So when you look like you're leaving, one of the things, these people who just keep talking the whole time, they're like that, right? And they'll say things. So before you leave, just one final thing, right? It's a bit like that character in Groundhog Day. He never shuts up. I just want to get away from him. But that's what they do. They just engage and engage and engage and engage. Never want to let you go, because that's the way they are configured to do that. So that's that one aspect. And then the second thing you mentioned is the errors. And those errors will always be there, because it's within the DNA almost of a large language model that there's an element of randomization associated with it. And the reward function rewards guessing rather than finding something correct. So this is built into the architecture of a large language model. So it's inevitable that they come up with what we call hallucinations, because that's the way they are designed to do so.
Can I ask you, I had an interesting call earlier on today with a potential coaching client, and they were talking to me about a colleague that they were speaking with who has this inkling that people leaders, right, are going to become a thing of the past. That role is going to be completely automated, right? And for me, I'm sitting there thinking, well, I couldn't disagree more, but also I'm very biased, because if that role is completely redundant, well, then a lot of the work I do no longer will make sense, right? I'm just curious as to, when you see, whether it's in education or whether it's in corporate, companies that are at the forefront of, because we hear everyone talk about AI, and it's like a race to integrate AI into your business in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
But are you seeing anybody who's doing it really well, who's really at the forefront of adopting this technology for the betterment of the people and the organization?
I think the easiest, or almost like the first level use of large language models is to use them in their free version, right? To the shadow AI, right? And we get a lot of people doing that for personal reasons and for professional reasons as well. But when it's made official and when it's legitimized and brought into the organization, the first and the easiest way to use generative AI is to take an underlying large language model, and it doesn't matter which of them, right? Because the differences in terms of performance at the top end is like paper thin, and then to configure it by fine tuning it for some local content within the organization. Best example, I've used this before, is revenue. Right, revenue have tax and duty manuals. They have rooms full of them. There could be 100 pages talking about some particular corporation tax or personal taxation, etc. And if you work in revenue, then one of the things you have to do is basically learn these off by heart or know where to find them. Do a Control F for a search for them. And what revenue did about 18 months ago was they took a few different large language models, fine-tuned them on all of this local content, hosted it on their own cloud service and ring-fenced it so it can't be accessed. And now what happens is if you work in revenue, you have a question, etc., you go and ask the local revenue ChatGPT equivalent, and it comes back with the answers. There's an example where you take a model and you're fine-tuning it with your content and providing a conversational search tool for your own internal content. So revenue have done that. I came across an example a couple of weeks ago where Tala Hospital, as anybody who has been diagnosed with cancer in Tala Hospital has to go through an oncology screening to see how, what kind of chemotherapy, etc. So they want to know lots of stuff about your background and history and allergies and blah, 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 blah. And you used to have to travel to Tala Hospital to do that. Now they've configured a chat interface, fine-tuned with the content from this, which somebody can access from a laptop from their home instead of having to traipse from Donegal or from Valentia Island all the way to Tal Hospital to sit, wait, to have your whatever number of minutes interaction session. Instead, you basically do it at home. And the time to complete that is down to 6 minutes. So a 6-minute laptop session instead of a trip to Tala Hospital. Again, large language model, fine-tuned with content, knows which questions to answer, and it's got 98% accuracy compared to a human. And there's lots of other examples. So to go back to your question, are there any examples of people who are doing it well? The people who are using AI well are realizing where it can solve a problem and solving that problem well, where the problem is solved by a question answering search type of interaction. And so for Tala Hospital to revenue to dime a dozen others places, that's the great place where you can get that low hanging fruit. Beyond that, it's more difficult to see where AI, generative AI, or even agentic AI can be used in an organization. And I think people are still trying to find their feet with embedding it. And you're right, there's a race to be on to be seen to be using it. Why? Because if we don't, then we're very, previous century type thing. So everybody else is using it, therefore we have to use it too. But that's not necessarily true. Everybody else is looking at it just as way you're looking at it. So find a problem for which it is an appropriate solution, deploy it, advertise it internally, promote it, reward it, and then let people who work in your organization identify subsequent problems or situations where AI could help.
It's interesting because what I hear quite a lot as well is companies talking about their AI strategy. And then you ask some employees, and the employees are like, it's mentioned all the time, but we actually don't know what. So I think there's an element of kind of social desirability of you're doing it. So we better be including it in all of our comms. But as you say, it's how practically are we utilizing this? And so, for example, I see good companies use it well in terms of in my area where they're creating, similar to what you've described, these interfaces where, I'll give you a prime example. It could be a sales leader who's about to step into a pitch with a client, and he now has this interface, or she has this interface where they can practice the pitch.
Yeah.
They can get feedback in real time from this AI interface on which parts are strong, which parts might be lacking. And that has the ability to potentially analyze all aspects. So not just the content, but potentially the tone of voice, the body language, etc. Again, I can see how that can be extremely beneficial. But
and when you pair that away, Mark, what that is it's a large language model. It's GPT something, it's Gemini, it's Claude, it's Copilot, one of those, fine-tuned with a lot of content on how to make a presentation.
Yes.
And maybe it's a presentation in a particular domain. So if it's anything to do with car sales, for example, you'd fine-tune it with a lot of stuff to do with new cars, prices, comparisons, all that sort of stuff. Yeah. So you bundle all of that, you overlay that on top of the underlying language model, and then you prompt it. So the first part is called fine-tuning, and the second part is prompting. And the prompting is basically the programming or the instructions. It says, analyze this input from this candidate who's doing a draft sales pitch, etc. Particular look for cases where it's weak, strong, blah, 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 and then give them feedback. It's the same it's the same dance again and again.
Yes.
Underlying model, fine-tuned, prompt engineered to do something. Stuff.
Yeah. Can I ask you, so my space as well as coaching, right? I do quite a lot of coaching. Right. Yes. Where do you see the developments in AI? Do you see a point in time where coaching, for example, becomes something that's primarily done by an AI interface, looks very human, can connect with the person sitting across? Like, is there going to be a point in time, do you believe, where something like as personal as a coaching relationship becomes something done through AI and potentially as effective?
It's tempting, isn't it? Yeah, but it's fraught with dangers.
Yeah.
Because those large language models, which are made available as chatbots and almost configured with this priority to engage, have got some great upsides, which we've talked about, but they also have got some great downsides. And in particular, the addiction to them and the mental health issues arising from the addiction to them. And we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg now with especially younger people, but not necessarily just younger people. One of the things that OpenAI did about 5 or 6 weeks ago, so it was about in October, was that they published a response to challenges on the mental health issues associated with ChatGPT, and they proudly said that only that 0.15%, that's 0.15% of their users, had suicidal ideation in their conversations. Now, hang on a second. That's 0.15% out of 800 million. That's like over 1 million people have interacted with ChatGPT and have had suicidal ideation. Wow. And of course, when you interact with ChatGPT, it doesn't block those conversations. Yeah. If you interact with ChatGPT and you start to do copyright violations, it'll shut down the conversation. But if you start talking about suicidal intention, it'll start to talk about methods and how and when. And you're right. All of that sort of stuff. Yeah. And what was really disturbing about the OpenAI announcement was, first of all, the fact that there were that many. But second, equally disturbing thing was that in ChatGPT 5, we have engaged with hundreds of mental health experts to be able to shut down these conversations with an improvement of 65% accuracy. Oh, so you mean instead of 1.2 million people with suicidal ideation, you'll be able to shut down the conversations in 2/3 of those, which means it's only about 400,000 people, 400,000.
Yeah,
right. Yeah. So the addiction aspect of those is a downside. Go back to your question again. Is some sort of chat AI-powered chatbot going to replace people coaching? Apart from the mental health addiction aspects to it, the second aspect, and it's completely different, is that you can never replace the wisdom, the intellect, the experience, the social interact that comes from a person. Because a person like you, Mark, you've had years of experience in social interaction with everybody. And as you're coming up with the next question that you're going to ask me, right, there's a chaos going on in your brain, an interplay between me looking at you and looking for facial reaction and your experience with that, the knowledge that you have of this area, the background research you would have done into this podcast, what we've said before up to this point, your knowledge of me. There's a huge amount of interaction, chaos going on in your brain, coming up with what is the next question to ask. AI is not even close to that level of sophistication or of humanity. And as a replacement for a person coach, it's tempting to see, but the flaws with that, like the mental health issues, etc., are very quickly exposed. So, no, I don't see it being replaced.
That's good to know. Thanks for that, Alan. Yeah, and it's again, if we just look at geopolitical landscape at the moment, veracity is optional.
Yeah.
We see very autocratic leadership style now dripping back in. There's always, I suppose, a danger that these tools are falling into the wrong hands. Yeah. And there is a danger that we may be passengers in this rather than, let's say, having a level of agency where we can utilize them the way you're utilizing them for the good of whether it's students, whether it's government initiatives, etc. There's always that potential danger that we could lose a level of agency. And what I'm reminded of is even aspects like the Cambridge Analytica scandal and how as part of that whole process, so many people were manipulated by these tools and these large organizations.
And if you remember going back, and that's nearly a decade ago now, Cambridge, we've stopped talking about it now, but to remind people, what happened was that Cambridge Analytica, the company, were able to identify and classify personality type based on anything from 80 to 120 likes on Facebook. So all you had to do was like 80 things throughout your lifetime and it would know what kind of personality you have. And as a result of that, they then targeted personal advertisements based on geography, gender, location, for those people who were likely to be in the middle in terms of voting. They could go either way. Personalized advertisements targeted against the personality, and basically just delivered those in Facebook. And in President Trump's first his campaign for the first time he was president, he spent more money on Facebook ads than on everything else combined. So that's how he got that election, was targeting advertisements on people, and that those advertisements were not seen by anybody else except the target that it was aimed at. And the footprint that was used was just Facebook likes. Now, if you think about it, the digital trail that you've left behind on ChatGPT or whatever kind of AI-powered chatbot, if you go into the personal sphere, you're asking questions. Yeah. And you're leaving an awful lot richer footprints behind than just a like on a Facebook page. You're asking questions, that might be to do with your personal relationships with others, your health, your wellness, all sorts of stuff that you're leaving behind. And that's an awful lot of revealing of the inner you to what you believe to be, a sacrosanct chatbot that'll, will always, tell me more. Oh, really? Oh, tell me more. Tell me more. And it's sort of pulling this conversation out of people. Now, those conversations and the insights from those conversations have not been used in any targeted way. Like when we do this with going back to the educational case, I used it in order to be able to identify recurring topics that students were asking that I may not have taught well enough. Like if they're all asking about p-values or something, then there must be something to the way that I presented that. Now, that's sort of at a population level rather than targeting James, who was one of the classmates in that class, and learning about what he doesn't know. But if you look across the set of those, I was able to identify parts of the course that they got stuck on. Now, going back to the ChatGPT or the Claude or Gemini or Copilot, whichever one you use, there's an awful lot of information on you is left in there. And if one of the things you could do on whatever is your favorite chatbot is look on your previous chats. Yeah. And just the titles of those chats tells an awful lot about you,
Yeah.
So
no, it's really, and again, you can see as you're speaking there, what comes into my mind now is I'm thinking developing my own little chatbot for any programs that I'm running, prompted with the content that's relevant for the group, but then more so try to capture the themes in those groups. So for example, if I have a leadership program, I might have 4 core modules.
Yeah.
If I have all that content prompted in that large language model, and then I give the group use of that to ask it questions, and then obviously anonymously I can analyze the themes.
Yeah.
All of a sudden then your workshops or your facilitated sessions in person maybe become far more pointed, because you're able to capture, okay, what are the group really struggling with? And you hope you've got that figured out beforehand, but rather than being too presumptive, you could have that as a tool which keeps, let's say, refining the accuracy for that group as you go from session to session.
Yeah, yeah. And that's great to think of that on a group size, whatever size group that might be. Imagine that on a national level. And that brings me to Estonia. So in Estonia, what the Ministry for Education has done for high school students is that they have contracted with OpenAI and with Google to take basic versions of the foundation models, the large language models from each of those. They have then fine-tuned those with Estonian content, Estonian culture, Estonian language, Estonian literature, Estonian course content. And they have made this available to, I think it's 40,000 high school students in Estonia. They have trained nearly 5,000 teachers during the summer just past on how to use this. And they now present this in schools as an option that teachers can either decide to use or not to use in whatever way they make appropriate. And it's free. And rather than it being the free version of ChatGPT, they're getting the customized version of ChatGPT and of Gemini. I think it's a 50-50 divide just to see and not to be locked into one vendor. So you can imagine this being a great prop for those teachers who decide to use it in their teaching. But can you imagine the log files and the traces, not assigned to an individual, but analyzing those conversations and those interactions and looking at themes that recur repeatedly across the population of students in a particular subject. Now that's brilliant insight. Never get that any other way. It's great. You might have picked up in your workshop example just from body language or from hearing the same questions, and what you talked about and gave as an example is a good way to automate that. But doing that across an entire nation, an entire curriculum, and seeing where the pinch points are, where kids are getting stuck with particular topics, that's information and feedback you'd never get any other way. So I can see the wheels turning in your head.
Because you know what I'm thinking? And again, I'd love to get your take on this. I'm preparing a dissertation at the moment, right? And I'm still, it's a psychology master's, right? So it has to fall into the sphere.
Is this another master's now?
Yeah. But I'm even just thinking, if, let's say, I was to put together a research proposal which was going to capture one of these large language models and try to elicit a large body of data in my area, which would be for leaders or managers, and try to really understand them. So previously I've done qualitative, I've done interviews with them and taken those insights and created themes. As we keep moving forward with research, is there going to be an element where we can utilize those large language models to capture those themes, as you're describing, 40,000 kids in Estonia now, as those years go on, the data that's going to come from those is going to be incredible.
Yeah.
Is there an element now where research will move towards, and it probably already has to a degree, where we're utilizing those? Ethically, is that something that easily would get approval, or is that something that is still a little bit?
It's hard to stop. And one of the things you said in your preamble to the question was that imagine the data that's generated, but the data that's generated from Estonia for good. Imagine, I would phrase that, sorry to correct you, but imagine the good that you could do with the data that is gathered on the footprints from all of the kids in Estonia.
And by the way, that's what I mean for that cohort of managers. Like, can we collect data to help them in terms of, I always find that cohort within organizations are the ones that are most stressed. They generally feel the most pressure. And often they're not willing, not that they're not willing, but sometimes there's a hesitancy to come forward and say that I'm struggling or say that I don't know how to do something, because all of a sudden then, my reputation might be damaged. And is there less invasive ways than an interview of trying to collect? Now, yes, there are surveys, but people find surveys boring. Is this interaction with a chatbot or a large language model a way where we can elicit real feedback to help those individuals at that level?
Yeah, because when you're interacting with one of those AI-powered large language models, it's a conversational. It's the Turing test, right? Which has been passed because you believe, or you are led to believe, right? Unless you have to keep slapping yourself in the face and reminding yourself, this is only AI, this is only a program, it's not anthropomorphized. So it basically engages us in conversation and dialogue, which we're very comfortable with, more so than filling out a survey. And for those people filling out their oncology pre-screening in telehospital, it is a much more, it's not a pleasurable experience, but it's better than filling out a form and ticking boxes because it's engaging in conversation. And we are much more comfortable with that than ticking boxes or filling out forms. And when we do that, then we tend to reveal a lot more, even in the way that we the language we use, the words we choose, the way we phrase, that kind of things. And if it's a voice input, then the way you intonate, all of that kind of things. So you're giving away a lot more. You are open to giving away a lot more, and provided that's managed and captured and analysed in an ethically conformant way. And it's hard to see a downside.
Yeah, and are we there yet? Are we getting close to that in research?
Going back to the question in research and in your master's, the part which is the literature survey, looking at that's now really assisted by AI tools. And there's tools like elicit.com and there's others which basically they're fine-tuned and they're trained on scientific literature and on academic literature rather than on the internet. And therefore, they're very good at pulling information from previous publications. And so there's your chapter 2, the first version of your chapter 2 done. But remember, you have to check everything and read everything and make sure it's valid. But the part in, coming up with hypotheses and coming up with experimental methodologies and then carrying out all those, that is something that is still part of the scientific process. It's something that's still done by humans. Somebody said to me recently that when I was talking about AlphaFold, which is Google's or Google DeepMind's production of the 200 million 3D structures for amino acids. And it used to take a PhD student 4 years to do one of them, and Google automated it and did all 200 million and put them on the internet. Wouldn't you hate to be one of those PhD students who had spent 4 years defining the 3D structure of a protein and find that, it's been automated? So some aspects of the scientific process are automated and can be automated and assisted greatly with AI, but other parts still require the same steps as previous.
Really interesting. Out of curiosity, in Estonia, of the teachers, how many were pro and how many were against adopting it?
I was there visiting and looking at this about 2 months ago. And as of 2 months ago, before it had launched, 60% of the teachers had taken on the training and indicated they were going to use it. And they expected that and hoped that would rise to 75%. So 2/3.
Very good.
2/3, 3/4.
I asked because my wife is a secondary school teacher here in Ireland, and I'm just picturing some of the people in the staff room that she tells me about, and I'm thinking,
and I imagine there's some who are complete in denial, who say, never, over my cold dead body shall this AI be used. And for those teachers, with respect, your students are using it at home. And then there's others who are innovative and trying to do things, it's great to see that happen. When it comes to second level, though, we are certainly not leaders in the use of AI. We are a long way behind, and I am going to be critical of the Department of Education here. It took the Department of Education more than 550 days between announcing that there would be guidelines for the use of AI in schools and eventually producing those guidelines, which the minister produced about 6 weeks ago. And let's just say that they leave a lot to be desired. They talk about using generative AI to help in drafting policies, and There's nothing there to support the accessibility of generative AI in schools. There'll be some schools from disadvantaged areas where kids are all just using the free version, and then there'll be some schools where the school will subscribe and will take out subscriptions to paid versions. So there's very little support in those guidelines produced by the minister.
Yeah, it's a shame, isn't it, that we're not quicker at adopting some of these aspects that are clearly they're coming, like they're already here.
Yeah.
Other countries are adopting and utilizing them, and as we say, getting this good, rich data, like Estonia as an example.
It could be used for in so many ways to improve the teaching and learning and education processes, but also, and that's one outcome. So you learn your science or your history or your geography better, but it also would make our younger citizens, our school kids, much more digitally literate and AI literate. Because at the moment, the vast majority of them using the free version of pick your favorite model just think it's, I don't have a clue how it works. It just does stuff. And one of the things that was found recently is that the more people don't understand how a language model works, the more they trust it. Yeah, I know. Your eyebrows shot up with that. Yeah, the less you understand about how it works, the more you trust its output. And the corollary of that is that ignorance is bliss. And if you learn a little bit more about it and you start to learn about how it works, you actually mistrust it more. And that's exactly the place you want to be.
Yeah.
It's exactly the place you want to be. So currently there's no scope for improving AI literacy at a national level. There's no national program. In the AI Advisory Council in January or February this year, this is what we advise government to do, and there's been nothing about this. There's nothing in the nothing concrete in the guidelines from the ministry for our school kids about improving AI literacy. So they're just basically blindly going on and basically, using this thing and trusting it because they don't understand it and because they haven't been informed or taught to that.
And you mentioned earlier on about, one word you'd use around the whole topic of AI is curious, be curious about it.
Yeah.
And if we're just taking these products for what they are, and as you say, just using it blindly without actually trying to understand or be curious about what could it be doing with my information, or why is it interacting with me in this way?
Yeah.
If I'm just blindly using it and, as we say, trusting it, well, then that's where we're going to find ourselves, potentially in a harmful situation with these tools. Whereas adopting a curious approach is probably the way we need to go.
Yeah, I think the more curious we are as people in our personal and our professional lives, the better we are, the more satisfactory we are. And I used to use that quote, "Be curious," which could be attributed to the US poet Walt Whitman. But I think the better example that I draw it from is season 1, episode 8 of Ted Lasso. If any of your listeners have heard this part, it's the darts scene where Ted is playing a darts game against Rupert. Have you seen it?
Yeah, I have.
So you know exactly. You can replay it in your mind. And as he's going for, I think he has to get 2 treble 20s and a bullseye.
Yeah.
And he's got the 2 treble 20s and he's just about to hit the bullseye. And he says, "They never asked. I was always be curious." And then he hits the bullseye. It's a great scene, isn't it? So be curious, attributed to Ted Lasso.
Very good. And if we think about, I can imagine if you mapped out a timeline of the last, 2 to 3 decades in the advances in your area, it'd be fascinating. As you look to the future, we obviously have aspects now like agentic AI, which I have no clue, just what the advances in that area are like today. I know you have a great understanding. I'd be curious to ask you, like, what does the next decade or 2 look like in this area of AI?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that since generative AI arrived and turned the machine learning paradigm on its head completely, that has impacted society big time, and people are much more familiar with it, and we're seeing it in workplaces and so on. But it has also impacted computing research enormously as well. And my favorite area of AI research would have been in computer vision. So basically analyzing images and videos and looking at content and that kind of stuff. And we were making slow incremental progress with that. And it was measured, and the trajectory was a particular climb, success rate, and you could project where it would go. But generative AI has basically pivoted that upwards. And in the scientific domain, in computer vision, in robotics, and all the stuff associated with computing, the progress in the last 10 years has been more than in the previous decades. So trying to project where this is going to go, right, is extremely difficult because the future is coming much, much faster. And that's different from the public familiarity with generative AI, which is also moving very fast. It's really, PhD students working on computer vision now are using foundation models that weren't a thing 3 or 4 years ago, just literally were not a thing. So the methods that you would use in computing have now completely been turned on their heads. One of the big conferences in multimedia was held in Dublin about a month ago. There was about 2,500 delegates came from around the world. PhD students, postdocs, researchers, academics, etc., all presenting papers and posters, etc. And more than 60% of them use foundation models, which were not a thing 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah. Predicting where it's going to go, it's hard to say. I'm even wary about saying what's going to happen next week, because there'll be another announcement, not of a new model, a bigger model, a larger footprint model trained on more data model, but applications and the impacts of them. It's really difficult to predict. I know no matter what I'd say, the only thing you could predict with certainty is that whatever you predict, you're going to be wrong. Yeah.
Seeing a lot of advances in agentic AI, you've mentioned, in particular models from the likes of Microsoft. And would you give us just an insight into what you're seeing there, or what we are seeing there?
Yeah. So what happened with large language models as they were being trained with more and more training time is that they started to get cleverer at their answers. They started to be able to do more inference and deduction and reasoning in reasoning out complex questions, answers to complex questions. And this happened because they were given more compute time. In other words, to take their training data, turn it into a model. Instead of giving it 2 months, give it 3 months, and let's just see, it'll come up with the model. Still looks the same. It's the same size model. Internally, it'll be different, but it's able to answer more complex questions. And that was a natural progression over the last of the first 2 years of the development of large language models. Separately, and in a completely different part of software development, there's a technology called agent software, where what you have is not a program that does something, but you've got an orchestra of programs. And each is like an orchestra, a different instrument. It does different things. It has different expertise. And you can give it different inputs, and it'll come up with outputs. And in agent-based software, what you do is you control, like a conductor would control an orchestra of different instruments. You give the problem to the set of agents and you say, go and solve it yourself. And they can talk to each other, those programs. That's the second thing. So putting those two things together, people realized that if you had agent-based software, and whenever it got stuck in trying to resolve a problem, it could ask a large language model. Then agent-based software could start to do cleverer things, more worldwide applications, real-world applications. And the coupling of a large language model, doesn't matter which one, which is able to do reasoning and solve problems, with agent-based software, which has got expertise in different areas, started to put together. This only happened about a year or a year and a half ago, when people started to put these two things together and realized that previously, agent-based software only worked in very small domains. Now it can work in the real world. Because when an agent program gets stuck with trying to resolve some problem, it doesn't know how to, it goes and asks a large language model. And the large language model is now able to give answers to that. One of the examples that you can see for this is called deep research or think deeper or research mode, which is available on every one of the AI-powered chatbots. So if any of your listeners have got access to a laptop or a phone and you're not driving or anything like that, you've got this, go to your favorite AI-powered chatbot, and the marketing people will brand it differently. They might call it deep research, they might call it research, they might call it think deeper, they might call it whatever. So whether it's Copilot or Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini, switch on that option. which by default is switched off, and ask a question which is a really hard question, which requires a bit of research. So, for example, one of the things I did was that I asked for a team sheet for Irish soccer team, the best there ever was. Okay. And it came back and it said, okay, well, do you mean Republic of Ireland or do you mean Northern Ireland? I mean Republic of Ireland team sheet. Okay. And then it went off and it came back and says, do you want a 4-3-3 or a 4-4-2 formation? And I said, I want a 4-4-2 formation. And as you're putting this, as this is happening, these questions, what's happening in the interface, it doesn't matter whether it's a smartphone or a laptop, is you're getting the queries that the agent system is putting to Google and you're seeing the answers coming back. And at that point, it spawns off 8 or 9 different searches. So it says, go and find the best goalkeeper. Okay. Go and find the best left back, the best right back, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And each of those agents, right, basically, there aren't 11 because there's 11 on a football team, but it's 2 central midfielders, 2 centre backs, and 2 strikers.
Yes,
okay.
Yeah.
And each of those is an agent. It's a program. It's a Google search told to go and find the best left back, the best right back, etc. And eventually what happens is that, they'll talk to each other because there'll be some players who could play in multiple positions. So we can't come up with the same name on the team sheet twice. So the 2, the agents, the 8 or 9 agents will talk to each other to make sure there's no duplication. And eventually it'll come back with the team sheet. And it'll say, Shay Given in goal.
Was it Shay? It was not Packy Bonner, no?
No. Bonner, if you're listening, Packy, Bonner made one good save, right? But Shay Given has been consistently a better goalkeeper. And Dennis Irwin and maybe Stevie Staunton and then Kevin Moran in the middle maybe and Keane, of course, et cetera. And you can start to play with this. And this is a great example because what it does is it shows you all of the underlying searches happening like they are different agents tasked with going to do something and collaborate with each other to make sure that the players aren't duplicated and played in multiple places. And this will take you 3 or 4 minutes.
Yeah.
There's no rush, but it's almost like a spectator sport watching this unfold. And that's your first taste, listeners. That's your first taste of seeing what agent-based software looks like. You have commandeered an orchestra of individual agents, individual programs tasked with going and doing something, coming back, and when they are all finished, then they will give you the team sheet. That's the first example. And I'd encourage people to have a go at doing that. Now, there are much more meaningful examples of agent-based software starting to appear in healthcare and in business processes and so on. But to get a flavor of, because you began this question about 5 minutes ago by saying, I'm not too sure what agentic AI is. Now you can see it by using one of those AI-powered chatbots and a hard question, not an easy one, like a difficult one that you have to go off and do, that it has to go off and do research and see how it collaborates with itself and then comes back with a consolidated answer.
Yeah, I see it like in, I suppose, all our worlds to a degree, strategic decision-making, that being a core element of your strategic decision-making process and getting that information back in, as we said, 5 minutes versus having to go off and do a ton of research. You can get pointed insights that are going to help you make those strategic decisions far faster than you would have previously.
Yeah, but again, you have to ensure that you check everything because there can be hallucinations. And I remember doing this question, doing that query once and insisting that each of the 11 players had only ever played in the Premiership or the First Division. So that would rule out who, for example, Keane.
Up
front. He can't because he played in. You can't have Brady playing. You can't have Liam Brady playing because he played in Italy. You can't have. Could you have Packy Bonner? He played for Celtic. So it had to be Premiership. So you have to check all of these things. So this is part of what the agent-based software would do. And I remember doing that, and it came back and it excluded Roy Keane. And I said, "What about Roy Keane?" And it said, "Well, he signed for Juventus. No, he didn't actually play for." Yeah, no, actually, it allowed Scottish Premier, but he did play for Celtic. Yeah. So it made an error because it had deduced that he had played for Juventus, but he only talked about signing for Juventus,
So
and he
there's an
didn't in
error
the
that
end.
can- yeah.
So there's an error,
Yeah.
a hallucination that
Yes.
crept into the reasoning.
Really interesting.
So you can't just take this 11-man timesheet or this team sheet and run with it. You have to check all of these things yourself.
Yeah, and probably the most famous case we've seen of recent times is the Deloitte Australia situation where they produced a report for a client and it had errors in the or hallucinations in the report, that some of the information was wrong.
Yeah.
I don't know if you came across
I didn't come across that one.
It did. It made some it made the headlines for sure. But essentially that's what it was. They produced a report and it was, some of the information was false basically.
Yeah.
And they had to repay the client and
RFK Jr.'s report, White House report on Make America Healthy Again, also had half a dozen errors and hallucinations, which the White House press secretary said were just typing errors. But this is an example even closer to home. Kieran Mullooly used to be an RTE reporter, and then he went to Europe, got elected as an MEP. He wrote a letter to Ursula von der Leyen about Gaza and about the situation. And it was revealed in the letter that he talked about some family, etc., which was completely made up. And it was hallucination. And he got caught with this. And he was dragged onto Drive Time to be interviewed by Sarah McInerney. And I can see your face, Sarah. And being interviewed by Sarah McInerney can sometimes be like a blood sport. But she gave him an easy ride. She just basically didn't ask him the hard questions. What he should have done was he should have said, I made a mistake. I put my hands up. Please, the lesson here is check the contents, check the outputs from AI. Don't fall into the same mistake that I've done. Instead, he tried to basically say, I was so busy, I had to read 1,000 emails, and tried to squirm his way out of it. But basically, you can get caught.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm definitely going to remember that, Alan. There's other things I'm going to remember, one of which being that my coaching profession might be safe for the time being. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned a lot from our conversation today. I know listeners will have as well. So I really appreciate you taking the time to join us on the podcast today.
Thanks very much. Time has flown. It's been very enjoyable. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me on the Lead Well podcast. As always, if you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit that subscribe button.